Okay, so JavaScript in the DOM. So we've talked about JavaScript, a little bit of the basics of how we use JavaScript. So let's talk about how we actually interact with our HTML page. What can we actually do with JavaScript? So the first thing to understand is the DOM, which is a very important concept. So DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it's a fully object-oriented representation of our web page. And it can be modified by JavaScript. So the DOM is basically what JavaScript interacts with. So it's a object-oriented representation of all of your HTML. Your JavaScript can interact with it and change it, and then your page is updated as you change the DOM. So the DOM should match your HTML code, although it may change after being manipulated by JavaScript. You can change some stuff, and it may start to not match your actual HTML code once it's been changed, but it will reflect what's actually shown by the browser at a given point in time. So whatever the DOM says is what the browser sees, even though, so again, you may start to change stuff with JavaScript and it'll no longer match your actual HTML, but it will match what's shown on screen. Excuse me. Being object-oriented, the DOM provides a number of properties and methods and events that can be used by JavaScript to interact with and manipulate the web page. So there's a bunch of functions built in we can use. There's events that we can respond to, things like that, to kind of interact with the page. So here's kind of a visual representation of what the DOM looks like. So at the root we have the document, which is just kind of how we refer to your HTML in JavaScript. Then you can see there's kind of this tree. So we've got our HTML element. We've got our head element, which then has a title inside of it, and this title element further has your text. We have our body element, which has an H1 and an A inside of it. They each have their own text, or like this A has a href attribute. So again, kind of think of your HTML as an object with properties within it. And that's kind of how JavaScript sees your HTML. So again, the HTML DOM is kind of the standard object model and programming interface for HTML. So it defines all of your HTML elements as objects. It defines the properties of all your HTML elements. So things like href, classes, IDs, things like that are accessible to you via the DOM. It has methods to access all of your HTML elements. So you can select things by ID or by class to kind of get the actual elements themselves to be able to change them. It also has events for all of your HTML elements. So things like on click. So you can respond to a click event when someone clicks on a link or a button. So again, in other words, the HTML DOM is kind of the standard for how to get, change, add, or delete your HTML element. So it's how we interact with our page. So again, here's another example, just kind of showing there on the left, kind of the DOM tree. So again, think of like an object with objects nested within it. We've got our page title here that's nested within the head. We've got our H1 and our paragraph that are nested within the body. And those are each objects that then have their own properties and attributes, such as the text within them. We've got the ID of our paragraph that we can access, those kinds of things. So assessing DOM elements. So how do we actually read the DOM in JavaScript? So we access using an object named document, calling various methods on the document. Will return objects that we can then interact with. So the most common one that we use is getElementById. So document.getElementById, and we pass in some ID as a string. And that will select one element by its ID. So this is kind of why it's so important that our IDs only refer to one element, right? So IDs should be unique. GetElementById will only return one element because by design, IDs are supposed to be unique. However, you can use document.getElementsByClassName and pass in a class name, which will get multiple elements. And you can even kind of see in the name of the methods there, getElementById versus getElementsByClassName. The second one will return multiple elements. It returns an array. It's actually an array-like collection of elements. It's technically an object, but you can interact with it like an array. And so that's where you would iterate over them through a loop. So say you've got like a bunch of links on your page. They all have the same class, and maybe you want to attach an event handler to them if they're clicked. You would use get elements by class name to select those elements so that you can then attach the loop through and attach a handler to. A couple of more ways to access the DOM elements. There's a newer method that's really useful called query selector all. This actually lets you pass in a CSS selector. So in this example, we have like p.intro, which would select a paragraph with class intro. So again, this is just a little bit fancier way to return. This will also return an array of elements that you have to iterate over, but it lets you use a little bit more fancy selectors. You could use an actual CSS selector to select your elements. So you could do, all paragraphs inside a div with class intro or something along those lines. So you can get a little bit more fancy than just an ID or just a class. You can also do named item. So this is a way to get form input value by name. So you've got a form. A lot of times when the user submits the form, you want to read the values of what's being submitted in your JavaScript, especially if you're doing Ajax or something. So you can do get element by ID and select your form, and then you call .elements, which accesses the elements inside the form. And then you would call .named item and pass a name, and then .value, and that would get the actual value of that input. So the input with this name. So you're selecting by name. Again, that's just a useful way to grab the value of a form element. If you want to read some more about that, there's a link there with a little bit more examples and details about selecting form elements. So once you've actually selected an element in the DOM, the properties of that element are available. So in this example, we've got a paragraph with a class of intro text. It's got an ID of main description, and then it's got some text inside the paragraph. So we could do var p document.getElement by ID and get the main description. So it's going to select that paragraph. Then we could do like console log p.id. So .id now is going to be equal to the ID of that element, or p.innerHTML, which will return all the HTML inside of that element. So that's a really useful useful variable as well. So there's a ton of properties like that. I can't go over all of them, but you can look it up in the documentation. I may even have a link at some point in here that kind of goes through all those properties. So another example, so we've got an A that goes to google.com. It's got an ID and a class. So if we select by ID of Google link, we can then select the href of the A, which is google.com. You can use .ClassList to return an array of the classes that are on the element, or a .ClassName, which returns the classes in a string. So again, there's different reasons you would do it either way, but they're both available to you. So if you want an array of the classes, you can do that. If you want just a string that contains all the classes, you can do that as well. If you were gonna like add a class, you would probably want to get the array. If you were just doing something else, you might just want a string with them separated by commas. So like class name is just everything inside the class attribute. Whereas class list actually transforms it into an array for you. Here's another example where we're dealing with an image. So we've got an image that has a source, it has an alt tag, it has a style tag associated with it, and an ID. So we can select it by ID, and then we can look at image.source to see the actual source URL. We can select image.alt to get the alt text, or like image.style.width to get the width of the element as defined by the style. So it's useful, and these are where we can actually adjust those properties as well. So I'll do this a lot where, I say one common thing to do is like if you want an image to change, excuse me, on hover. So like the user hovers over an image and you want to change the source of it. We'll do this for like 3D effects sometimes, like a button or something where you hover over it and it goes from being 3D to flat to kind of look like you're hovering over it. You could have a hover listener and set image.source to some other source on hover, something along those lines. So all of these attributes you can change as well. Like if you just do image.source equals something, it will update update the property. Okay, so manipulating DOM elements. So once we've selected an element within the DOM, we can modify it by changing a property or by calling a method. So if we do like element.innerHTML, element here being whatever element we've selected, and we can just assign it like a regular variable. We can say innerHTML equals and then pass in some new HTML as a string, and it will change the HTML of the element. Again, it's not going to change it in your actual HTML code on your HTML page, but it will change it in the screen the user is seeing. So the DOM gets updated. It doesn't necessarily write to your HTML, so, but it affects what the user sees. We can also do element.attribute and just pass in some attribute, so like ID or class name or something along those lines, and give that a new value as well. Again, that should be something like source or href or class name or ID. There's also a method for setting attributes. We can call element.setAttribute and pass in the attribute name and the value to actually set the value of the attribute. Just kind of two ways of doing the same thing. We could also change like the style of an HTML element. So we could do style dot and then some property, so style dot width or style dot color. And set those to a new value. So here's kind of a something of a real-world example. So we've got just a simple HTML page with a header and a paragraph that has some text and then a link inside of that text. So in our JavaScript, the first thing we'll do is get element by ID of intro header and set the inner HTML to a new header. So it's just going to replace where it says my intro with a new header. We could then grab the intro text paragraph and set style.color to red. So now our paragraph is going to be red instead of just the default black. We could select our intro link and set the href to a different link. So we could set it to 2.html instead of 1.html. We could also call the setAttribute method instead of just setting the href and set href to that URL. Yeah, thanks. We could also get all of the links. There's only one link, but we could get elements by tag name A. So we're grabbing all of the links. And then we can loop through them. So we can do a for loop where our conditional is if I is less than links.length. And for each link, we can change the href. So we could do like links I to access the link that we're actually iterating over and set the href to something else. So again, those are the kinds of things we can do to start actually manipulating our page and changing things with JavaScript. We can also create new elements. So this is another really common thing to do. So we can use document.createElement and give it an element name to create a new HTML element. We could like set the inner HTML of that element to some HTML. We could remove an HTML element by calling element.removeChild and removing a child element of something. These are just all kind of separate examples. We could append child, so like say we had a div, we could call div.appendChild and pass in our new element to append a new child element to what we've selected. We can also do element.replaceChild to just swap out an HTML element with something else. So there's some documentation here that kind of goes through. Again, these are just a few examples. I can't really cover every possible way of doing this, but these are how we would kind of create new elements and add them to our page. So this is really common to use when you're like fetching data from an API or something in your JavaScript, and then you want to write that data to the page. You would use like document.createElement to add the elements containing that data. So here's an example. So we've got a div with a heading. We could do P1 is document.createElement of type P. So we've created a paragraph. We can do P1.setAttribute and set the class to important. So P is now going to have class equals important. We can do P1.innerHTML equals, and then some text goes here, so we're adding some text to our element. We could then do document.getElementById section 1, which is our div here, and do append child and pass in the P1. So this is how we would actually add that paragraph to that div. So again, it's append child, so it's going to be inside of that element. It's also append, so it's going to be below all the existing elements. So by calling append child, we've got our div, our heading, the paragraph would go right here, and then the closing div. So it would be, the last child added. We could then select the heading, so we could do document query selector all and select ID section 1 space H1, which would select our heading here. If we wanted to, we could then loop through those headings and call getElementById section 1 and remove child and pass in the heading that we're looping through. So if we wanted to get rid of all the headings on the page, we could do that. Again, not super practical. You're probably not going to want to do that, but there are times where you would want to remove things, like if you're building a to-do app or something and you want users to be able to delete, to-dos that they've created. You could, probably want to, write that request to the server and say, okay, they've deleted this item. Then you also remove that HTML from the page, at least if you're building kind of an Ajax-y type thing. Okay, so event handlers. So event handlers are used to specify a block of code that should run whenever a specific event happens on your web page. So this is really useful part of JavaScript. So we have onClick, which is an event that triggers when an event is clicked on. So we can have, any element really can have an onClick event. We can use onChange to trigger when a form field is changed. So I use this a lot for like search forms. If you want like a real-time search, something like Google where, as you type, it's filling out results. Or maybe it's preparing an autofill or something like that. So you can have onChange where anytime the form value changes, run some code, like maybe run the search and display the results or something along those lines. We have onMouseOver and onMouseOut, which trigger when a user hovers over an element. So again, we track both mouse over and mouse out. So we track when they start hovering and we track when they stop hovering. So there's not just kind of a hover event because there's two different events there for when they've begun and when they've ended. There's also an onMouseDown and onMouseUp to trigger when the user clicks on an element or when they're no longer clicking an element. So we use this a lot for like drag and drop. So you could select onMouseDown, which is when the user has started clicking to drag, and then onMouseOut is when they've released the mouse button. I've used that a couple times for drag and drop stuff where once they've, like onMouseDown, excuse me, you want to maybe remove, change the positioning or, figure out a way to attach the position to the mouse position. And then on mouse up, you want to see where the element is and where it's been dropped, and then maybe submit that to the server or something like that. We also have onLoad, which will trigger when the page is loaded. So if you want to wait for the page to load or wait for an image to load or something like that, you can use an onLoad event to track that. So event handlers are added to an element object like this. So we would do like document.getElementById with some ID. And then we can do .onClick equals, and then we have some function that is going to be the function that runs when that event triggers. So that's the way that you kind of handle that. I think I have an example here. So we've got an A. The text just says click here 0 times. And then we've got a script that we initialize a click counter variable. Document.getElement by ID click me, .onClick equals function. And then we've got our curly brackets. So we increment the click counter. And we also set, excuse me, this.enterHTML equals click here plus click counter plus times. So it'll just update the link the number of times you've clicked on it. I'll show that example in CodePen here in just a second. There's also an add event listener method that allows you to connect an existing function to a listener on an element in a little bit cleaner way than the event handler itself. So again, these are just kind of two ways of doing the same thing. But say we have this function called increment text, where we do the same thing. We do the click counter plus plus, and we set our inner HTML. We could then do document get element by ID, click me, add event listener, click is the event, and then increment text is the function that gets run when that event happens. So again, just kind of two different ways of doing the same thing. Again, here's some more kind of resources. Again, I haven't covered everything that's possible. I haven't given you examples of every possible thing because we'd be here all day. But this are some good links to kind of, if you want to keep exploring, kind of keep learning how you interact with the DOM, want to see some more examples, those resources will be useful. Let me go ahead and show an example, jump back to this this example here. Let me close this. Select it. There we go. Laptop's running slow. Pull up CodePen. And if we wait for this to load. Okay, so let's paste our JavaScript here. So we need a link with ID of click me. So A, ID equals click me. Let's give it a blank href. Let's see, click here 0 times. So now we've got this link that says click here 0 times. And then as we click on it, probably need to refresh or save at least. Okay. So now when we click on it, maybe not, it's not doing anything. Kill this href. ID. Click me, add an listener click, text, yeah. Oh, you know what? I think I need to say, okay, let's try that and see if There we go. So now when we click on the link, it actually increments the click counter, and it writes the HTML here when it does .enter HTML and passes in the new text. So as we click on the link, the text actually increments each time with the number of times that we've clicked on it. So that kind of thing is useful. We'll use stuff like that. So again, this is how you use an event listener to respond to some sort of event that the user has taken. So something's happened on the page, we respond to it in some way. We make some change, we write new HTML. We could also, we could do anything in this console log. We could alert and say user clicked. So now when we click on it, we'll get an alert that we clicked, something along those lines. You can do anything that you want inside that function, but it's going to happen every time your event happens. Okay, so that wraps